Close enough, I guess I'll get started. So, I'm Shannon Roddy. I'm going to be talking about SAML. The exit's right there if you want to leave. So, I'm going to talk about mostly my history in research and education, contrast that a little bit with how the rest of the world seems to do SAML, and then talk about some things that may be coming up in the future. That was the original title, but apparently that doesn't work so well for schedules and such things. But I got started in this space in LIGO. I don't know how many people in the room know what LIGO is. Yes, I was flying the plane and taking the picture. I cannot multitask like that anymore. So when I got started with this stuff, it was back in the days of people walking around with pockets full of these little notebooks. That's actually that notebook, full of passwords, right? We had wikis, we had email, we had websites, we had everything that we had to authenticate to. In LIGO, we had, PhD physicists who were trying to access all of their resources at different universities because it was a collaboration of a bunch of different, 25 universities, whatever. When you forget your password or your password gets locked, who do you call? Nobody knew, right? So that's what started us along the way on trying to do single sign-on and federation within LIGO. In those days, it was the fairly early days of SAML and SAML federation. We were using Shibboleth. Anybody recognize this shirt? Michael and Scott, you don't count. Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. Hence we say LIGO. What's that?
Say it again. Slower.
Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. So about 2007, 2008, I think this whiteboard is actually like circa 9, 10. Obviously, we were talking about remote user, we were talking about session lifetimes, right? This was a picture of a whiteboard at Caltech when we were trying to figure out how to do all this stuff. Notice the username and password on the top left for wireless. I don't know if anybody knows who that guy is. Maybe half the room? I don't know. He's got a YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day. He presented to NASA a couple of years ago, and it's actually a pretty fun video. I suggest you go look it up if you haven't seen it. But he had some observations, right? But who is he? He's going to go present to NASA? His observations were all about standards engineering, complexity, communication, things like that. He had observations about how Project Artemis was going. So anyway, he went and did a presentation. So last year was my first year at Identiverse. I had a bunch of hallway conversations. My language with SAML isn't the language with SAML that I was hearing coming back at me. So kind of inspired me to come here and talk about what I've been doing for 15 years, 20 years. So I have some observations. Get some definitions out of the way. When I say R&E, that's research and education. When I say NREN, that's the National R&E Network Operator. So in the US, that would be Internet 2. So there's like SUNET. There's a bunch of different national research and education network operators that serve basically universities and research. At the bottom, Federation Operator, generally that falls in the lap of the NREN because it was a natural place for that to land when we started building SAML federations. Bilateral is typically, I think, the way that most people in this room do SAML. You have a IDP, you have a relying party, you negotiate a connection, you're done. Multilateral is how we do federation generally in research and education. In the US, in common is the federation in the US for R&E, and it's a full mesh multilateral federation, which means every IDP technically can talk to every SP. Every IDP in the Federation is aware of every SP in the Federation. Yeah, so I work mostly in R&E. SAML is incredibly flexible, which causes its own problems. Anytime you're working with something that's extremely flexible, people can make choices. Your outcomes are variable, right? If they're good choices or bad choices. In R&E, we've constrained all that flexibility with our own standards and practices that are driven by the Federation operators and the interfederation of all of those Federation operators. But it's still SAML. At the end of the day, it's still SAML. We may do some extra things, but it's still SAML. So this timeline, so all the way back 99, 2000, there were sort of growing efforts in the US at research and education institutions. The NSF wrote a grant to Internet 2 to work on some of this stuff because they were the NREN. That sort of grew into the NSF Middleware Initiative efforts, and so there was grant funding to spend effort on trying to solve these problems. Everything that's in green is SAML. The blue things are other things that were kind of related, but happened along the way too. So Cosine was developed, CAS was developed, OAuth was developed, OADC, OAuth 2. And the interesting thing on this graph is you see kind of like a little flurry in the beginning, then it kind of tapers off a bit, and we go into production mode. And then all of a sudden at the end, the last couple of years, there's been like this explosion of effort again. And I'll point out 2012 was SAML was dead, long live SAML. So 12 years ago, we were having the discussion of whether or not SAML was still a thing. Is it going away? Is it still alive? And all of that development is on the right side of that arrow. So, obligatory. So when we do SAML in research and education, we have a bunch of different standards and practices that we've developed. We have EduPerson. I don't know how many people have heard of EduPerson. Okay. We go further, though. We have entity categories in SAML. So with the Federation operator sort of brokering this stuff, the Federation operator can tag certain SPs and IDPs and say, are you research and scholarship? And then my IDP can make decisions based on that tag in metadata and say, I'll release these attributes to you because you're one of my kind, right? Or you're one of this special set of SPs. I haven't seen anything like that in the commercial space. We're also multilateral, which I touched on a little bit earlier. Just about any of my relying parties and IDPs in the Federation know about each other. They can choose whether or not they're going to do anything, but they're at least aware that the other entity exists. So we have Federation operators. Like I said, in the US, it's in common, which is part of Internet 2. Legally, I think it's actually a separate entity, but it's like a child LLC or whatever of Internet 2. We have discovery services, because when you have a federation that has 700 IDPs, how do you get to the IDP to log in? And it's not the NASCAR screen, because that's not scalable, right? It's not sign in with Google and Apple, and right? We have 700 IDPs. Kind of a newer thing. So we used to bundle federation metadata as an aggregate. You would get one big XML file with all entities in the federation, IDPs and SPs. There was also an IDP only feed if you were just an SP, but one big aggregate, right? So it was all of the entities in that file. Well, you have to sign that, cryptographically sign it, so that you know it's authentic and that the federation operator actually produced this metadata aggregate. Canonicalization, anybody? Once you get like 50 megs, 70 megs, 80 megs, 100 megs, that starts getting pretty intensive to canonicalize and then sign and then distribute. And then everybody that gets it has to canonicalize it, verify the signature, right? It's resource intensive. So there's now a standard. You can kind of think about it as like DNS for metadata, right? You get something, there's somebody's trying to sign into some entity. Well, I don't have metadata for that entity yet, so you call that to the equivalent of a DNS server and say, I want the metadata for this entity. So you get one entity cryptographically signed, so the canonicalization issue becomes a whole lot easier. Verify the signature, and then proceed. What's interesting about that is you're getting metadata automatically. You don't have to pre-configure this stuff, right? All you have to do is tell your IDP or SP, this MDQ server, that's my source for metadata. And then now you no longer have to have everything all pre-configured. We've got a number of convention standards and practices that we follow. We basically do all of this stuff by consensus as a community. There's participation agreements, so if you're going to be in the federation, you have to sign a participation agreement. And it says certain things about how you're going to behave in the federation. We have things like baseline expectations, which is it's kind of geared around metadata quality, also security, things like that. Make sure that the contact information that's in your metadata is actually accurate and up to date, right? We have REFEDs, which is Research and Education Federations, I think that just stands for. But it's basically a working group. And on that timeline slide where I showed all of the flurry of activity that's happening, most of that's happening in the REFEDs. And that's a international working group, basically, of all research and education federations. Certify is all based around security. So you're going to conform to certain things. You're going to have contact information where if there's a security incident, and I know it's your SP, I'm the IDP, how do I reach out and contact you when I know that there was some security issue that happened between those two? We have privacy and non-privacy preserving identifiers. So we have completely opaque identifiers that we can use in the federation. So you just get a blob, but you know that person is an actual person at that institution, whatever. So think of that like if you're accessing a resource at a journal publisher, you're doing research on something, but you don't want the publisher to know who you are pulling down that article. Of course, we have the usual, this is John Doe that's signing into the service, right? So non-privacy preserving identifiers. We also have user consent. So for certain sites, you can turn on consent so the user can say, I want you to release my attributes, I don't want you to release my attributes. Of course, if you say, I don't want you to release my attributes, you may not get access to the site. We have all kinds of token translation proxies, CI logon. So CI logon is a service that allows people to use SAML to actually access high performance compute resources and things like that. So it'll go from SAML to X509, or it'll go from SAML to SSH, or whatever. They've started calling these things middle things. They're just proxies, same thing. We built all of this stuff on top of just SAML 2 core. So there's all kinds of profiles and all kinds of extra stuff that we've just layered on top of the plain SAML 2 standards. I think one of the things that we failed to do was evangelize a lot of the stuff that we were doing to the wider community. I came here last year and I started explaining how we do SAML, and I got lots of blank stares and confused looks and what do you mean multilateral and all this kind of stuff. So we failed in publishing, documenting, evangelizing, reaching out, right? We sat in our own little silo and we did our things. So right now I operate an IDP for UC Berkeley. And this is the scale that I have to operate at. I have 640 attribute release policies that are all custom unique entity to entity. I have 550 bilateral RPs between my production and test environment. In common, their scale is we have 6,000, well, it's more than that now, greater than 6,000 service providers in the Federation. And I think I looked a little while ago and it was 750 IDPs in the Federation. EduGain is a federation of federations. So if I want to talk to somebody in Italy with my IDP, we do that through EduGain. So every national NREN that has a federation, if they participate in EduGain, all of the other national federations can get that metadata and talk internationally. So it's federation to federation at that point. Generally, to clarify, generally, like the federation operator is not sitting in the middle of that. It's just a normal SAML IDP to RP. But the fact that we have federation operators and federation of federation operators means that everybody gets the metadata. So they know about each other. Berkeley has over 100,000 active local user accounts, and that includes things like alumni that haven't been multi-factored yet because they don't want to pay the licensing fees for multi-factor for alumni accounts. We're working on that. So that's the scale that my IDP has to serve. We generally talk about all this stuff as like a trust fabric. So I trust my federation operator. I trust my federation operator to do the right thing. Same thing for a service provider. They trust the federation operator. So it reduces the amount of trust that I have to have. I don't have to trust every entity that I'm talking to because I know that trust is established. So there's a bunch of different architectures, right? So in common is a full mesh multilateral federation. There are other federations that are hub and spoke. There's other federations that are any number of things, right? So, but as a federation, they're federated with the other federations no matter what their internal architecture actually is. What if you're not RNE? Which I think is probably most of the people in here. You're exchanging metadata manually, right? Are you going to do it through RFC 1149? Send a carrier pigeon to get your metadata over to this other entity that you want to talk to, or you're going to do it by email? Are you going to post it on a web page? Remember, I said I have to manage 650 bilateral integrations also, so this is also my world. There's been some efforts like FastFed, well-known endpoints, things like that, try and make some of this stuff a little easier. I think FastFed pretty much fizzled out during the pandemic. There's other alternatives. So like if you're an Okta customer, you get a dashboard where you can go select from a bunch of apps because it's pre-configured. You click the button, yeah, I want to enable that one. But it doesn't scale. It's only whatever they have on the dashboard. After that, you're back to bilateral. You're back to manual configuration. Most of the time, the metadata is not signed, so you're trusting, how did I get that metadata? Did I call somebody on the phone? Did I email them? Right? There's no cryptographic trust there. Vendor documentation. So if your IDP is X, do Y, right? Lots of screenshots. No hard requirements, right? More times than not, when I'm having to integrate with a SaaS vendor, it's screenshots of products that I don't use. So I have to reverse engineer all of the screenshots from some vendor-specific requirement or example to get to a set of requirements. If I just got the requirements up front, I wouldn't have to do the reverse engineering. I've run into lots of violations of the SAML 2 standards, right? So I've had to deal with SaaS vendors who will not take a URI as an entity ID. I'm stuck because my entity ID is a URI. It looks like that Amazon one. RPs that request nothing to be signed, right? How secure is that? Lots of WS star stuff. There's lots of people that use CA signed certs that have a lifetime of a year, and I think the CAB form wants 90 days soon. So that's going to be fun when we have to rotate certs every 90 days. SAML is an explicit key trust protocol, right? It doesn't really care about the certificate information. It doesn't care about the expiration. Yeah, so I already talked a little bit about how flexible SAML is. It's a strength and a weakness. For a couple of years, I was talking about it like the English language. You can do just about anything with the English language to convey something. A colleague of mine told me the other day, he says, no. SAML is the Latin of identity protocols. I'd argue that most of the problems that we run into is that SAML, so we're asking companies who offer a service, and all they care about is that service, to be experts in IAM, SAML, and federation. That's not their core competency, nor should it be. At least in R&E, we have a federation to go back to, and we have a community that we can ask questions of. So, we run into something, we can go back to the federation operator and say, hey, we're running into this. How do we solve this problem? And when you're doing a B2B, you don't have that. I think SAML's been really successful. No, it's not dead. Yes, I said it. Different ecosystems and sectors and verticals, they all use it in different ways. I think R&E is one of the few places that has really taken it to its full potential. Some places just do the very bare minimum bilateral agreements, and that's it. Other places, we have full-fledged federations. So what if SAML goes away? Do we pivot to OIDC? What if OIDC goes away? Is this FUD or not FUD? Because there's some things that are coming down the road that might make this happen. So I don't know why I put FastFed on there other than just like a reference, but we've already seen third-party cookie deprecation. There's potential of link parameters deprecation and redirect deprecation. So I'm not going to try to say that word right now. Eve Mailer gets credit for that. The week of April 8th, I tried to get a teledoc appointment. I couldn't do it. Browser failed. Browser failed because of third-party cookie deprecation. That was my professional life becoming really personal really quickly. Turned off third-party cookie blocking, and I was able to get a teledoc appointment. But the thing is, I know what was happening. How many of our customers out there in the world would know? So this is interesting. This is if each of those things get deprecated, what breaks? And it goes through OIDC, SAML, obviously WS feds on there, but who cares, right? Anyway, go take a look at that chart and look at the things that break with each of those things that the browser vendors are threatening to do in the future. And there's, unsure futures right now. So a future without SAML, why do I care? Why should you care? I mean, we're all using SAML. SAML's all over the place, so we all should care about it. And, IPv4 to IPv6 has gone really quickly, right? I care about it because it makes great things happen in the world. That happens to be a picture of Ray Weiss, who was the 2017 50% share of the Nobel Prize in Physics from LIGO. I use that because he always had his glasses in his pocket, and that's kind of a stand-in for password notebook. But so what do? Do we build new SAML bindings? Maybe, but the technical committee that that works on all that stuff was sunsetted last year. So we spin it back up. I don't know. RNE is considering potentially new SAML bindings as a worst case, but I don't know how we get there. And so back to Destin Sandlin, when he was speaking to NASA, he made the point that there was a report that was done after Apollo on what made Apollo a success. And we've got 25 years of history working with this stuff. So are we proficient enough at learning from our past and not blowing things up in the meantime? I don't know. I think standards development is being done differently today than it used to be. There's a lot of pay to play, right? You got to spend $10,000 to join the standards organization to even have your voice heard. I think I'm running out of time here. Yep. So anybody wants to learn more about how SAML is used in RNE, I'm happy to discuss. A couple of my colleagues are in the back of the room too. For more info on how the browser changes might affect SAML and OIDC, how many people in the room know Heather Flanagan's name? Look up Heather. She's got a couple of presentations. She's involved in some of that work. She's got a lot of documentation, a lot of pointers. Otherwise, find me. I'm around. And we're at time.